Well, welcome everyone very officially now to Annual Gathering 2024, which we are delighted to be able to hold on Zoom. I started to prepare some slides, and then I decided that we don't need more very small font for everyone to look at for a little while. And I just wanted to open our gathering first and foremost by saying a huge thank you. This gathering in its entirety would not be happening whether we were in person or here on Zoom without our board members. I am the only staff member of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship, although we do tend to kind of include Andrew as staff because he does a huge amount of our admin, especially financially. But our board, which we have many board members here with us tonight, does a huge amount of work and really put a ton of effort into this gathering, especially as I needed to take some time away for family needs this summer. So starting and opening with thanking you all for your efforts in this, but also all of you who are attending. We really think through our gathering themes every year based on just what we're hearing from you. Are the things that matter to you that you're wrestling with? So I know Ray earlier talked about climate change being a significant issue, and that is something we've been hearing from you and is some part of how we started to frame this gathering. The title of this gathering this year in 2024 is Living an Anabaptist Healthcare Ethic, Past, Present, and Future. We are celebrating 80 years of Mennonite Medical Association and Mennonite Nurses Association, who eventually formed together to become Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship. And in doing so, really thinking also about what the legacy, not just of the history on paper, but the legacy of community and the legacy of the ethic that these groups, Mennonite Medical Association and Mennonite Nurses Association, not just talked about, but lived over the years. And I'm even reflecting on what I heard just now we had a social gathering just before this session started, on the number of folks who said, well, I become a part of MMA because this person invited me to their house or invited me to a gathering, or I went to this gathering and I met people. So this idea that community is such a heart of who we are. We also are incredibly lucky to have Joe Kotva with us this weekend, who was a founder of AIC, or Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics, which also became a part of MHF a number of years ago now. And so in thinking too about our history and the role of the Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics, we really wanted to focus this gathering on this idea of what is an Anabaptist healthcare ethic, but also how do we live that ethic in our daily life, in our history, in our present, and in our future. And that's the core of the weekend. And we felt that the most important thing to start with then was to start by reviewing not the history just in terms of a timeline and dates, but a history as it was lived. And so we were incredibly excited to invite Paul Leichty back to do that. And we then wanted, in this same Friday night, to go ahead and start reflecting on this question of what is an Anabaptist healthcare ethic. And so Joe is then going to speak after Paul on this question of moving towards an Anabaptist healthcare ethic. What might it be? And we know that she'll be somewhat of an interactive session. So that's the plan for tonight. Tomorrow, first thing in the morning, at 9 o'clock, we have a session where you all are really welcome to come and both ask your questions of us as the board in terms of what is the future of MHF? This gathering is past, present, and future. What are we hoping to do in the future? But we also want to hear from you. What do you feel the future of MHF should hold? What do you feel are the core things we should be focusing on and the things that have mattered most to you? And we really would appreciate your time to join us for that and to share of your wisdom. And then we have our session on Anabaptist ethics and climate change with Joe, a break from lunch, and then we'll hear from Dodanim, who is the current chair of the Global Anabaptist Healthcare Network. In the last session, people raised their hands if they'd spent time overseas, and it was a good number of folks. But we also talked about developing regions in the US. I think that Mennonites have long been involved globally, and not just American and North American Mennonites being involved globally, but global Mennonites. We are a global family, and MHF, MMA, MNA have tended to be more North American, but that is really starting to spread out. So we look forward to hearing from Dodanim. And then on Sunday, we are invited to a special session at North Baltimore Mennonite Church to hear from Jeannie Davis at the Anabaptist Disabilities Network, which again is even a deeper connection than that, as Paul also was a significant part of the Anabaptist disabilities work for many, many years, simultaneously too, and after being MHF director. And so we really want to nurture that relationship as well, and thinking about how we are inclusive and how we, even as medical practitioners, the ways we approach folks with disabilities is an important part of an Anabaptist ethic. So that's kind of the overview of the whole weekend. We will start now with a few minutes to settle ourselves into worship. Kathy Shelley will be doing our worship leading, and I'll be doing a little bit of screen sharing to facilitate that. So Kathy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kate. I think, Kate, you're going to screen share for me the call to worship. I think everybody's muted, so keep yourself muted. Kate is going to screen share a call to worship, and I'll invite you to respond in the bold print where it says people, and I'll indicate by raising my hand when it's your turn, but keep yourself muted. It'll probably work a little better. This call to worship is from the new hymnal, Voices Together. And yes, let's begin. Jesus calls us to praise and prayer, to song and silence. Jesus calls us to worship. Jesus calls us to hearing and healing, to service and solidarity. Jesus calls us to love. Jesus calls us to advocacy and action, to protest and provision. Jesus calls us to justice. We hear the call of Christ. We worship together with joy. Please pray with me. Holy God, we thank you for this gathering, for the ones gathered here and there in our scattered places across the US and Canada, and also tomorrow in Guatemala. We remember those that 80 years ago started gathering to support each other, wanting to share and support each other in their faith and work connection. We pray, God, your blessing on our time together this weekend, in our remembering and reflecting, our learning together and growing in our understanding, in our connecting and reconnecting with one another. Be with us. May we in this time together be an encouragement to one another. May your presence in our time this weekend inspire us as we move forward to see more ways that we too, like those before us, can continue to connect our faith and our work in healthcare in all our communities and beyond. In your gracious name, amen. And if we were in person, we would pass the peace. We're going to do a sort of a virtual pass the peace in a moment. Friends, hear the words of Jesus. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. I do not give you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not let them be afraid. So would you share a pass the peace with one another by putting peace be with you in the chat, or you could do it to an individual or to the whole group. Peace be with you. And now Andrew is going to read our scripture passage for this evening.
I'm reading Hebrews 10, 24 through 25 from the NRSV. And let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I appreciate that that Hebrews passage. Let us not neglect meeting together. So we thank each and every one of you for being here and not neglecting to meet together. And we are going to go ahead and get set up for our very first session.
Wanda, not Wanda, Donna has a reading yet.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Can you all hear me?
Okay. Thank you, Donna.
I'd like to share a blessing on us called Evening Moment. Evening, cooler than in past days. The sky is quiet, polished purple, thickening with darkness, gently turning to octopus ink. A stand of trees, black against the horizon, shuffles vaguely, then stills. An eyelash of moon hovers over the horizon. It seems to be looking at you and me. Stars start humming their tiny, tinny tunes. The earth is not just there, but holding you up. With each breath, the evening air greets you, enters you, becomes you, and leaves in peace. A single bird note sounds, not a song, just a note, like one star, then silence. In the enfolding space, in the beckoning of the stillness, something in you stands up and speaks. And the earth and the trees and the sky and the very stars here and will remember forever. Amen. And I'll turn it back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Donna. Well, our first speaker is someone who I believe is truly familiar to most, if not all of you, and that is Paul Leichty. Paul has been working on really taking a deep look at the history of MMA, MNA, and Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship for a number of years. And so this presentation, I think, is a challenge to fit into 45 minutes because there's so much there. And of that, Paul has really taken time, not just to be able to tell you the facts, but to really tell a story. And so we're really grateful for the time you've spent on this and the time that you're here with us tonight, Paul. I will make sure that you can share your screen. And we will go ahead and get your slides up. Let me know if you need any help with that.
Okay, I think we've got it. I am very honored to be here with you tonight to share my thoughts on the history of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship and its two oldest predecessors, Mennonite Nurses Association, or MNA as I will refer to it, and Mennonite Medical Association, MMA. When I got this invitation,
I don't see your slides, just so you know. I'm not sure if you meant to share them yet.
Yeah, I did.
Just want to make sure.
Okay. Forgot to
There
hit
we
the
go.
share button.
There you go. We're very, very close. If you
All right,
navigate to your slides now.
now if I can get back to where I was. Yeah. Okay.
I still just see a picture of your screen, but I don't see the slides.
Okay. Let me go back.
Perfect. Now I see them.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you. When I received this invitation, I guess initially from Kathy, a bit of trivia reemerged as I considered accepting it. The last time I spoke in a plenary session of annual gathering was in 2018 at Bluffton University in Bluffton, Ohio. I realized at that point I was one of 7 persons on the program who were descendants or spouses of my wife Twyla's maternal grandparents, Bila and Mabel Bucher. Considering this year's recognition of the 80th anniversary of the founding of MNA and MMA, I decided to look further into the Bucher story. In a few minutes, I will tell you why. But another unique feature of the 2018 annual gathering also came to my mind, and that was the presence of several persons from the Plain community. These persons were present in 2018, and several more were present at Laurelville for the 2019 MHF annual gathering. So we begin our look at history, community, and ethics this evening with this story. In the last few years of my time as executive director of MHF, I became fascinated with a particular Facebook group called Anabaptists in Healthcare Professions. Who were these folks, I wondered? How did they suddenly attract hundreds of members? Wasn't it for Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship to build a network of Anabaptists in healthcare professions? How did I not know about this? Well, it turned out that this was a Facebook group whose primary audience was the so-called plain people who were entering the healthcare field. These were folks who were claiming the Anabaptist label for a culturally conservative Mennonite and Brethren movement that was somewhere between the Old Order Amish and Mennonite groups on the one hand, and the folks from Mennonite Church USA and its splinter groups on the other hand. These folks from the Plain community were in the process of moving from their tight-knit church communities with their emphasis on separation from the world into the professional world of greater engagement with surrounding society. As I started talking to some of these folks, I discovered that they not only had a Facebook group, but they also had their own conference where scores of them gathered for worship, speakers, and workshops. The Facebook group and conference were ways for them to discuss 2 primary tensions in their movement. On the one hand, were the issues of how to explain their entrance into higher education and healthcare professions to their more culturally conservative parents and church leaders. On the other hand, were the challenges of navigating in a secular world where the values and ethics they had grown up with were constantly being challenged. I was particularly intrigued because the tensions they were experiencing appeared to me to be much the same as those faced several generations ago among what are now mainstream Mennonites. And that leads us to the beginnings of MNA and MMA. 80 years ago, Mennonites in North America were dealing with the effects of a second Great World War. During the First World War, earlier in the century, Mennonites were largely unprepared to face the tensions of being a peace people in a time of global war. So following World War I in the 1920s and 30s, Mennonites in the US joined with other peace churches to negotiate a plan for the government to recognize conscientious objection and an alternative to military combat. In doing this, Mennonite church leaders needed to convince the US government that they were ready to emerge, albeit cautiously, from their isolationist and separatist stance and become useful citizens of their country. They just could not go to war. So in the process of this next level of interaction with the larger society, Mennonites in the US during the World War II era were grappling with many of the same larger tensions faced by the plain people of today. In Volume 4 of the historical series, The Mennonite Experience in America, titled Mennonites in American Society, 1930 to 1970, Paul Taves, the historian from California, uses the subtitle Modernity and the Persistence of Religious Community to describe this era. How does a people for whom separation from the world has been a part of their DNA for centuries now respond to modernity, modern life in America? What are the ethical commitments that are tested in that transition? What are the tensions, the changes of emphases, the new phases of life that emerge from that tension? Perhaps more importantly, how does the definition of community change in that transition? So chapter 8 of Taves' book intrigued me a lot because it's entitled Balancing Separation and Engagement. Mennonites who felt called to healthcare professions participated fully in that balancing act from separation to engagement from 1930 to 1970, just as the plain people do today. The question was this: is community defined as a separation from the world? In other words, my family, members of my congregation, knit together by a faith commitment in our relatively small rural communities? If so, the primary ethic is one of purity of the faith, or at least the faith tradition as it has been passed on. It is an ethic of non-conformity to the world, but yet in some ways a conformity to the church community and obedience to its leaders, who in that era were mostly called bishops. Or these folks were asking in that era, is there another definition of community in which our faith and our ethical commitments permit and maybe even require our engagement with the larger world around us, even though that world does not share our faith commitments? So this is a story of the new balance in the Mennonite community as young adults moved into healthcare professions. It's the story of how in their engagement with the larger world, they moved first into mittens and then into associations. Along the way, we will observe the themes and the ethical emphases that accompanied these changes. That is what first led to the formation of Mennonite Nurses Association and then Mennonite Medical Association in the 1940s, and eventually then to the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. Now, before going too far, we need to note that the storyline that we're following is largely that of the Swiss and South German wing of Anabaptism, the story of Mennonites and Amish Mennonites who first came to America starting in 1683. In my own personal history, this is my father's side of the family, even though our immediate ancestors didn't arrive in America until the middle of the 19th century. But my father's ancestors migrated first from Switzerland and Germany to the Alsace region, what is now France, but which was German at that point. This is where the Amish schism, with its emphasis on separation, predominated. On the other hand, on my mother's side of the family is the other major wing of Anabaptism, from the Dutch North German area spreading into Russia and migrating to the Russian Empire, into the area we now know as Ukraine. These folks were called Russian Mennonites in my day, and my maternal ancestors were among the first wave of migration to North America starting in the mid-1870s. So in turn, my father's tradition was called the Old Mennonites, and that's not to be confused with the Old Order Mennonites back in the East. These were just the Old Mennonites. Old Mennonites included Amish Mennonites who didn't observe the Old Order, but gradually then merged with Mennonites who had never been Amish. So that's how you got the old Mennonites. In many ways, the old Mennonites were viewed by the more recently arrived Russian Mennonites and others the way plain groups are viewed by many mainstream Mennonites today. So in general, Mennonites who stayed, excuse me, in Europe longer engaged sooner with the larger society and acculturated faster to that society, even before coming to North America. So, for instance, by the early 20th century, the descendants of this Northern European group had decades and even centuries of involvement in healthcare professions. There are numerous examples of Dutch Mennonite doctors in the 17th and 18th centuries, many of whom were also pastoral leaders in their congregations. There are also examples of Mennonites in Ukraine starting healthcare institutions to care for their own people with chronic illness, disabilities, and mental illness. Thus, Mennonites who migrated later from Europe viewed their spiritual cousins already in America as somewhat quaint and backward. The Northern Europeans were already embracing higher education, moving into professions and starting healthcare institutions. Thus, Mennonites in Kansas, largely from the Russian Mennonite tradition, had already started a hospital and school of nursing in 1908, more than 30 years before anyone thought of a Mennonite Nurses Association. This was the Bethel Deaconess Hospital School of Nursing in Newton, Kansas. I took these photos of the old buildings in 2013 as I remembered my mother, who graduated from Bethel Deaconess in 1947 and became a registered nurse. But the story of Mennonite Nurses Association starts with the first school of nursing started by the old Mennonites, as far as I can tell. That was the La Junta Mennonite Hospital and Sanitarium School of Nursing, established in 1915 in La Junta, Colorado, and operated under the Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities based in Elkhart, Indiana. So that brings us to the next phase of Mennonite history and healthcare, which I label missions. You see, Bethel Deaconess served a strong Mennonite community, but La Junta was a mission hospital. It was operated by a mission board in an area not otherwise known for its Mennonite presence. Mission outreach was the context and the rationale for old Mennonites to move into a more professional and institutional approach to healthcare. By the early 20th century, more Mennonites were interested in joining other North American Protestants in this missions movement. As momentum built, Mennonite mission leaders realized that taking the gospel to new people groups meant also attending to their physical needs of those they were trying to reach, a more holistic approach. By the late 1930s, then, Mennonite nurses were already being sent by mission boards as missionaries into overseas settings. This fit well with the holistic ethic of service in the name of Christ. Now, service has always been a part of Mennonite community life, but now, spurred on by the missions movement, service went beyond just mutual aid to others in the local faith community. Nursing became an avenue of service to others outside of Mennonite communities. Nurses could be involved in mission settings, simply ministering Christ's healing love to those outside their home settings. At the same time, they could help create the context in which the evangelists and church planters could share the word from a Mennonite perspective. So each year, a mission board meetings were held in a Mennonite community in the US or Canada. Missionaries on furlough would share their stories, mission leaders would preach and call for support and involvement in missions. A revival atmosphere would animate people to greater faithfulness in reaching out with the gospel message. Among the attendees at mission board meetings were nurse missionaries on furlough or returning from their years of service. They were joined by stateside nurses, particularly those from La Junta Hospital and School of Nursing. other interested persons also joined these informal gatherings. So in the mission board meeting at Haven, Kansas in the spring of 1941, there was enough interest among this informal gathering of nurses to form a committee to make plans for a more formal organization of Mennonite nurses. The committee consisted of two persons, Maud Schwarzendruber and Verna Zimmerman, both registered nurses employed at La Junta Hospital. So the next year, in June 1942, a proposed constitution was presented and provisionally adopted at the mission board meetings in Kitchener, Ontario. This then marked the birth of Mennonite Nurses Association, the earliest predecessor of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship. By the next year, 1943, MNA had regional groups that had already been formed in southeastern Iowa, Colorado, and Harrisonburg, Virginia, and soon additional groups were formed in Harper, Kansas, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Franconia, Pennsylvania, Ontario, Canada, Goshen, Indiana, and Fulton County, Ohio. Meanwhile, missions was emerging as a prominent theme of engagement among Mennonites in the two oldest and largest settlements in southeast Pennsylvania. These were the two conferences known as Franconia, primarily in Bucks and Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Lancaster Conference, starting in Lancaster County, but whose reach eventually extended to adjoining counties and even states. And now I might add even nations. Lancaster Conference began its mission board in 1914, calling it the Eastern Mennonite Board of Missions and Charities. Later, it was known as Eastern Mennonite Missions, and today simply EML. A personal note is that H. Raymond Charles, my wife Twyla's father, and the son-in-law of Bela and Mabel Bucher, who I will talk about in a minute, was president of the Eastern Board from 1956 until 1980. Now, as it happened, some members further east in Franconia Conference were serving in some of the home missions projects of the Eastern Board. And so Franconia Conference decided they should establish their own mission board, and they did so in 1917. 2 years later, that Franconia board established its own mission station in Norristown, the county seat of Montgomery County, just west of Philadelphia. This became First Mennonite Church of Norristown, and then Nueva Vida Norristown New Life Mennonite Church. And it was where I served as pastor from 1982 to 92. These two mission boards, while not the first, do link us to the story of MMA. And here's where I'll pick up the story of Bela and Mabel Bucher. Bela L. Bucher and Anna Mabel Musselman were married in 1914. They lived in York County, west of Lancaster County, a little bit further from the center of Mennonite community life, but still a part of it. They had 4 children. The oldest was Samuel Bucher, who was one of the founders and early leaders of Mennonite Medical Association. Bela was a pastor in Lancaster Conference, but pastors were still largely self-supported, and he didn't have a large farm. Thus, the family struggled to make ends meet. Mabel's brother, on the other hand, was one of 2 men sent by this Eastern Mission Board to search for a mission field in South America. So the family was very much interested in this emerging missions movement in their conference. Years later, Mabel wrote to her children and grandchildren after a rare long-distance phone call. A portion of the letter remains. I feel the Lord has answered my prayers better than I could hope. For from the time you were babies, my prayer had been that you would all grow up to be fine Christians and workers in his kingdom. And then she addresses Samuel in particular. Samuel, you were our first child, and I had hoped so much that you would be a doctor, as I felt a Christian doctor's witness work would be so great. Then when you as a child couldn't stand the sight of blood, I thought God isn't answering my prayers. But indeed, Mabel's prayers were answered. And she made special efforts to market her garden produce to earn the extra money needed to send Samuel to Goshen College. Mabel continued her special fundraising to send Samuel's sister, Anna Lois, to Goshen College as well. And Anna Lois eventually returned to Pennsylvania, married Pastor and Bishop Raymond Charles, who was president of the Eastern Board, as I said, from 1956 to 80, and they were the parents of my wife, Twyla Charles. Samuel Bucher finished his degree at Goshen College and entered medical school at Temple University in Philadelphia. Years later, he wrote, "I entered medical school with much fear, the only Mennonite student. Parents worked very hard to cover the cost of this. Mother was very happy that I was going to help others in this profession. I got all my meals at a local restaurant and slept at a boarding house. Graduation was March 1943, and due to the war and gas rationing, I graduated from medical school in the morning, was married in the afternoon, and left for our honeymoon in the evening." He continues writing, "It was impossible to set up a medical practice during wartime, so I was glad to work in a local hospital where my wife, Margaret, was a staff nurse." So meanwhile, back at Samuel Bucher's alma mater, Goshen College, president of the college, S.C. Yoder, asked another Goshen College alumnus who went on to medical school to return to the college. This was Dr. H. Claire Amstutz. He and his wife, Florence, a nurse, did indeed return to Goshen, setting up both a campus health service and a private practice. What's notable for our story is in the fall of 1943, Claire Amstutz invited a group of pre-medical students for an informal time in his home. He saw this as a way of reversing the trend of Mennonite young people going into medicine and then leaving their Mennonite communities and the churches that had nurtured them as they began their lives as physicians. And so he encouraged these students, while they were still at college, to commit themselves to service in the Mennonite church. Claire and Florence modeled this kind of service as they, the very next year, started service in Puerto Rico at the end of World War II. Eventually, they returned to Goshen College after their 3 years in Puerto Rico. They eventually led the first study service term, or SST, unit to Honduras in 1968-69, a program that's been very influential in having Mennonites internationally involved. So we go back to Pennsylvania again. In Pennsylvania then, after this 1943 meeting with Claire Amstutz, Dr. Samuel Bucher, along with Dr. Paul Nace, had a similar goal as they made contact with an increasing number of Mennonite physicians and medical students in the Philadelphia area. On May 10th, 1944, they invited all Mennonite and Brethren in Christ doctors and medical students in the area to the Bucher home in Sellersville, Pennsylvania. In the history of MMA, Walter Schlabach reports this meeting in this way. He says, "After a spirited discussion and sharing of vision, the group unanimously agreed that an association should be formed. The express purpose was for the fellowship, mutual sharing, spiritual nurture, and financial assistance. The majority of the students came from communities where there was little understanding of the tensions these young people faced. There was enormous pressure on the students to achieve academically while maintaining their faith values in an environment that was materialistic and non-Christian. The group that gathered that evening chose the name Mennonite Medical Association, and appointed a committee that included Bucher and Nace to draft a constitution. And so on August 2nd, 1944, a second meeting was held at the Nace home this time, where the proposed constitution of MMA was read and adopted. 10 charter members signed the minute book. By the summer of the following year, 1945, the Mennonite Nurses Association, which had already organized an Eastern Pennsylvania chapter, invited these members of MMA to be their guests for an evening of fellowship. And thus began a long period of cooperation between these two associations, which eventually led to the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. While this formation of Mennonite Medical Association signals for us a new phase to the movement, which I label associations, it did not mean the end of the previous missions phase. And that fact is amply illustrated in the career of Dr. Samuel Bucher and his wife, Margaret, who the latter essentially gave up her career in nursing as their children came along. With their first child already born, the Buchers left their Mennonite roots in Pennsylvania and moved to West Virginia, where doctors were desperately needed and where Mennonite and Church of the Brethren mission activity was already taking root. While missions was the theme that first drove the movement from separation to engagement, it was not an aggressive evangelism, but rather the ethic of humble incarnational service that motivated the Buchers and many others. That baby who moved with her parents from Pennsylvania to West Virginia was Sarah Ellen Bucher, who married Herbert Myers, who was a member of Mennonite Medical Association and president of the association from 1985 to 87. Many of you met Herb and Sarah earlier in our call this evening. They were among the presenters at MHF annual gathering in 2018 that I mentioned earlier. And Sarah shared with me that while the Bucher family was accepted and loved in their community, the local people were sure that when Dr. Bucher's children would be ready for school, the doctor would leave so that his children would have a better educational and cultural opportunities than the small, rural West Virginia community offered. But instead, they stayed. All 4 children graduated from the local school where they attended all 12 grades in the same building. But it was only when Sarah's mother died and was buried in West Virginia that the family ceased to be outsiders in the eyes of the rural community. And after that premature death, Samuel Bucher eventually married a single nurse who had worked in his practice for over 30 years. And when Samuel Bucher died, he was also memorialized and buried in West Virginia. Bucher family members, including Samuel's second wife, continue to make rural West Virginia their home. So to review a little bit, thus far we've traced a movement of Mennonite relationships to professional healthcare in 3 overlapping phases, which define what it means to be in community. At the beginning of the 20th century, separation from the world still largely defined community. Mennonites worshiped, worked, and socialized in fairly tight-knit congregational and Mennonite community settings. Here, the predominant ethic of nonconformity to the world meant conformity and obedience to the norms of the church as regulated by the pastors and bishops. Conformity was expected to a simple, non-resistant, faith-based subculture, which minimized and regulated interaction with the outside world. Mutual aid was emphasized as community members assisted each other in times of crisis. Yet, the missions movement in Protestantism started to influence Mennonites, leading many Mennonites to engagement with the world on a deeper and more spiritual level. It started with things like Sunday school and urban outposts and the exploration of foreign missions. But as the needs of the world became evident, particularly during and after World War II, Mennonites resonated more and more with an ethic of service. Missions and service was a way of engaging the larger world, reaching out with God's love, or as the MCC slogan put it, in the name of Christ. It was also illustrative of a notion that Mennonites were different from both the secular society as well as the typical American churches. And it was that difference that led to the formation of Mennonite associations. Now, associations were nothing new in America, as you can see in this list. What is interesting, I think, about Mennonite associations are the reasons for those associations. Most of those reasons are not oriented to further engagement in the world. Rather, they are oriented to a new form of inward focus or separation. That is part of the balance between separation and engagement that Paul Taves talks about in his History of Mennonites of this era. So in other words, Mennonites, having now decided to engage with the world by attending secular graduate schools and training programs, having now decided to enter complex healthcare professions, and having also experienced some of the nationalistic and imperialistic overtones of the Protestant mission movements, associations now became the new way of protecting and promoting the basic ethic of Anabaptism and community from which these pioneer Mennonite healthcare workers came. It became a matter of faithfulness to their Mennonite faith in the midst of their new professional lives. So it's interesting to note the stated purposes of Mennonite Nurses Association were these: mutual support. And it's interesting, they added emotional, spiritual, and tangible were the words they used. Mentoring. So experienced mission nurses supporting other new nurses. And then networking, which is an interesting word that we'll come back to. But perhaps most significantly, I thought, was support for nurses who at that time were at increasing risk of being drafted into the U.S. Armed Services during World War II. Now, all of these reasons for forming Mennonite Nurses Association relate to the felt needs of MNA members themselves to retain their Mennonite understanding of Christian faith. And thus, the governing ethic was a mutual support and encouragement of the individual's spiritual and professional life. The only exception may have been this concern about the draft, but in the end, legislation was never enacted to draft nurses, so that matter became somewhat moot. On the other side, we see the reasons for Mennonite Medical Association were noted: fellowship, mutual sharing, spiritual nurture, and financial assistance. And again, I would note here that initially this financial assistance, I think, was an expression of mutual aid to those medical students in need. But as time went on, it was the funding of mission-related medical training overseas, what was called the student elective term with Mennonite Medical Association, which MHF has picked up. But overall, you can see the internal needs of MMA members were uppermost. Engagement with the world was now a given, but the question remained how to balance that engagement with a separation from the world to maintain faith and ethical integrity. So let's return again to this association model. It really seemed to work well for MNA and MMA for several decades. Both groups had medical mission emphases which appealed to an older mission vision, even as the nature of overseas mission was rapidly changing. And so as the emphasis on evangelism waned, the strength of the ethic of service and international vision promoted by the Mennonite colleges continued to inspire a vision for outreach through Christian service via medicine to those most in need. And during the same time, career in healthcare became more accepted and encouraged, and so Mennonites felt more self-confident and saw less need for a specific Mennonite professional association. And this cut two ways. On the one hand, more Mennonites joined the secular associations. But on the other hand, the Christian medical and dental associations is an example of organizations that offered attractive options to Mennonites who were more theologically aligned with the evangelical movement and who also wanted more continuing education that CMDA could offer. So as new healthcare specialties emerged, associations had to deal with who belonged to these associations. Could dentists join the MMA? How about physician assistants? For nurses, did there need to be a certain level of education for nurses? And then how about other Anabaptist groups, such as the Church of the Brethren? Did they belong in Mennonite Medical Association? So in addition to these questions, the changing role of nurses and their relationship with doctors put some strain on the relationships between MMA and MNA at joint conventions. Particularly, nurses who were not married to doctors started to distance themselves from MNA. Instead, they gravitated toward the professional education opportunities in nursing leadership that were offered increasingly at the Mennonite Health Assembly. With less felt need to join Mennonite healthcare associations by the early 21st century, both MNA and MMA were searching for new ways to attract new members. With a long tradition of joint conventions, publications, and programs, MNA and MMA talked to each other and explored a new future together. And the result was the formation of Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship in 2011. The idea was to open up this new group to all Anabaptists of the many healthcare professions that were being developed during this era. The assumption was that the new openness to all healthcare professions and the emphasis on integrated healthcare would attract younger members to this integrated association. However, within 3 years of the formation of MHF in 2011, it was obvious that not all of the assumptions that projected a highly successful MHF were valid. The association model itself was giving way to something new. With the younger generation growing up with the internet as a way of rapidly communicating to folks near and far, it was easier and more exciting to build networks more closely tailored to one's preferences, whether they be professional, religious, social, or some combination of these and other criteria. And what was the point then of joining an association, paying membership fees, and attending far-off meetings when there were plenty of networking opportunities as close as your keyboard or the cell phone in your pocket? So networking has thus become the latest movement among Mennonites toward engagement with the world, moving away again from the more separatist model of associations. While networking is most often talked about in terms of individuals using cell phones and internet, even associations themselves started to build networks with the others who shared similar and overlapping interests around the key issues of the 21st century. I was recently reviewing the short history of MHF for an online encyclopedia entry that I hope to have published soon. I was struck with how much activity of MHF revolved around networking relationships. Clearly, this reflected the interests of those Anabaptist healthcare professionals who were joining MHF, who are far more eclectic and diverse, to say nothing of the interests of those who probably considered our association irrelevant. So anyway, networking became a key theme, and MHF built relationships with other groups. First of all, it was spurred on by the frequent question that MHF got about how we were different from Mennonite Health Services. And so MHF utilized the consulting services of MHS Consulting and eventually joined MHS Alliance as a member organization. Secondly, aware of MHF's roots, mainly in the Swiss and South German Anabaptism tradition that I talked about, MHF connected with the International Mennonite Health Association, which had its roots more in the Russian Mennonite tradition. Third, desiring to connect with students entering healthcare professions, MHF tried to build relationships with key faculty at Mennonite colleges, universities, and seminaries. In addition, MHF also helped keep alive the Anabaptist Center for Healthcare Ethics and the Mary Jean Yoder Memorial Endowment Fund. So in the process of this networking activity, MHF discovered individuals whose amazing professional careers outside of traditional Mennonite circles led to new, enriching relationships. I can only mention a few, but I think, for instance, of Nancy and Bob Martin, who opened up new possibilities to connect again with the Nazareth Hospital in Israel, where they had served earlier, and with the larger Nazareth Project, which set up a U.S. office. And then there's Ray Martin, who's also on this call, in his career work in international public health and community development, who led us to become involved with Christian Connections for International Health and a wider set of relationships. And Ray's philanthropy, along with the staff work of Beth Good and later Paul Shetler-Fast, connected MHF in a new way with MCC's more focused work on trauma and other international public health issues. And yet another of Ray's philanthropic endeavors, along with the vision of MHF's youngest board member, Lubov Slasheva, connected MHF to the emerging Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions that is now restructured to become Anabaptist Climate Collaborative. And again, as someone noted earlier, many of these threads have now come together for MHF, primarily a US and Canada-based organization, to become involved in the Global Anabaptist Health Network, which you'll hear more about as the weekend goes along. So in this balancing act between separation and engagement, noted by historian Paul Taves, the pendulum has swung again toward engagement, and it is happening via networking. But in this new balance, the themes and ethical emphases of the previous phases have not disappeared, but they have changed in subtle ways. And so I think from the separation phase, the ethic of obedience to a congregationally based spiritual authority has given way to the original Anabaptist call to discipleship. And even our notions of nonconformity, I think, are not so much anymore about outward cultural trappings such as clothing and entertainment and media tools, but it involves more of how we relate to the power structures of this world and how we use the power we've been given to empower others. From the missions phase, I've already noted the Anabaptist tendency to move away from aggressive evangelism to more of an emphasis on service and servanthood. Too often in the larger national scene, nationalism and neocolonialism has been promoted as almost synonymous with the reign of God. But as Anabaptists, we've emphasized a mission to love the whole world and to focus on humble service in the name of Christ that leads to a more authentic engagement with the world around us. And so I think networking results also in a recognition that the flow of resources goes both ways. We learn as we cross racial and ethnic and economic lines, and we also move from a paternalism to a partnership. Finally, I think there may be a place yet for associations. Associations can certainly remind us of our identity as a people of God, can remind us that beyond the labels or the common interests that healthcare professionals have, there is a discipleship ethic that binds us together. The current phase of networking can also be a reminder to be aware of our systems. It reminds us also that God's work does not always fit into our systems. The Holy Spirit is not confined to one denomination, to one culture, to one particular way of relating to each other, whether it be in a structure, a profession, or an association. But God is doing something new. And I think networking can remind us of that. An ethic of God's shalom will both define and empower the new community of God's Spirit under the lordship of Jesus Christ. God's mission can happen wherever associations are expanded into networks of God's people that are being built, shaped, formed, and reformed, and connected into the image of Christ. Thank you.
Paul, that had so many pieces that had me honestly on the edge of my seat. Thank you for, again, not just your work on this talk, but how you've really thought about the depth of this history and the ways that it shapes who we are today, and the connections, the web of connections of MHF. And these phases, I really, I love the way you framed this, and it's really food for thought. And it does, I think, walk us into this next piece of really looking at what is it to look towards an Anabaptist healthcare ethic, which is, of course, our next talk tonight with Joe Kotva. And Joe, I know you were here hearing Paul's talk as well, so I'm sure there's some things sparking for you. We are going to transition directly to Joe's talk. And then after Joe is done speaking, we will have discussion time where folks can also respond to Paul's talk. But thank you again, Paul. That really, that was really engaging, and I really appreciate your time. Joe, if you are ready to share your slides, let me make you the co-host now.
Okay, that did nothing.
Perfect. I see them.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Well, that's very curious.
I see them, but I see them in the mode where I also see your notes with them. So it's not like presentation mode. Still see your notes with them.
I don't know what's going on.
Sometimes it's a little tricky.
So you're seeing presentation mode?
Yes. So I'm seeing the one slide and then your notes with the next slide up.
I don't have any idea why that is.
If you go to the display settings at the top of your screen, see where it says display settings? You should be able to change that.
I do not know which settings you mean, because
I see a screen where up at the top center there it says show taskbar, display settings, and end slideshow. And I think folks are talking about that center display settings. Do you see that?
nope.
Huh. Very interesting. Do you want to just stop sharing and then try one more time?
And the thing is, it looks right for me. The screen where you all are is where the group one is showing, and my laptop has got the speaker view, so it's showing up just right for me.
Of course, that's the way it always goes, right?
So say again, what display settings, what?
Display settings is once you're in that like presenter mode, right? Where you've got the one slide and then the smaller next slide with your notes. Display settings is in the middle top of that. I don't know that much about this, but it sounds like Donna knows.
This is Michael. I'm also wondering whether when Joe shares his screen from Zoom, you often get to pick which screen you're sharing. So I'm wondering if you can share the second monitor.
Did that work for you?
Ta-da!
I have
That's
no.
it.
Yes.
You
Well,
got
that
it. Good
that
job,
is-
Joe.
that is completely backwards for me, but I'm glad it works for all of you. The challenge though is that then I have to look the wrong direction, but we'll live with it.
It's okay.
So Paul, thank you. That was really polished and really helpful, and almost the opposite of what I'm going to do. So yeah, I think we lost enough time with me trying to figure this out that we're just going to jump ahead. Okay, so what I'm going to do is tentative, exploratory, and the slides themselves are kind of rudimentary, but I'm hoping that they're going to provide us an opportunity to structure a conversation. Okay, now the slides don't change. All right. So this is just a few of the resources that are sort of in the background for me. Snyder's book, Health and Medicine, came out in '95. The pamphlet I did for the Parkridge Center on Anabaptism and Healthcare came out in 2002. The chapter I did for the Clinical Guide for Nurses came out in 2012. There's the Healing Healthcare book that we did for Mennonite Church. There's Willard Swartley's book on health, healing, and the church's mission. And then two things that are also playing around in my head here is a piece I did, I don't know, maybe 1998 or something on hospital chaplaincy, and a piece that Norman Krauss did for Mennonite Central Committee on sort of a theological justification for Mennonite Central Committee and its mission work. So that's just sort of sitting in the background. So I started by creating I took 5 minutes and just wrote down words that I thought that people in Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship would probably associate with being Mennonite or Anabaptist, and literally took 5 minutes and wrote them down. And I was going to throw them into one of those word clouds, but that turned out to be really unhelpful. It was just a mismatch of things. So then I started putting those same phrases into a grid and kept moving them around until it started looking like this. And then I got this from that grid. So this is like a first pass at what I thought people from this group might think of when they thought about sort of who they are as a Christian association and fellowship. More aspirational than reality. That is, these are the things we want to believe of ourselves, or things we believe ourselves called to be, but not necessarily always actualizing. So a countercultural, Christocentric community of discipleship, mutual aid, stewardship, and simplicity. Anabaptists respond to God's love, mercy, justice, and generosity with lives of nonviolent, sacrificial service. Empowered by the Spirit, Anabaptists witness to God's present coming kingdom by working towards reconciliation, healing, and hope. I'm not in any way suggesting this is comprehensive or even minimally adequate. I honestly took 5 minutes, wrote down a bunch of words that I thought people would resonate with, and tried to put them into some kind of coherent order. Because what I want to say to you is, I think you already have an ethic. I think you already know what your ethics are, and it's tied to all these themes. So if you think about being countercultural, right? So countercultural just means a subculture whose norms and values are different from the mainstream. Well, listening to Paul, that's the thing that Mennonites have been wrestling with the whole time, right? How do you be different and engaging with the mainstream? So to be countercultural, I think in part is going to mean that you always have a stance and a perspective that sits a little bit outside your culture. And for medicine, that means you're going to have a posture that looks at medicine with a critical eye. It doesn't mean you're always negative, but it means that you recognize that the social structures often reflect domination and injustice, and that's often going to be built into healthcare as a function of our society. But I think being countercultural also means that you're sort of constantly looking for alternative, better ways of delivering medicine. So locally, where we are, that would mean Maple City Healthcare. That would mean the Center for Healing and Hope. And I don't think any of those people are on this Zoom, which is puzzling to me. And it would also mean Mosaic, although I believe that Mosaic either has closed its door or is in the process of doing so. But for those of you who know any of these institutions, you know that these are ways of people that are connected to Mennonites that are trying to find better, more community-oriented, more holistic ways of providing care. Tim Jost once said to me that if we could just replicate Maple City around the country, a lot of our concerns about access would go away. So being countercultural also means recognizing, and this is something we can return to. My logic here is not as straightforward as the other 2 points, but being countercultural, I think, is going to mean that when we put that critical eye on medicine, we're going to realize that a lot of the language around ethics in medicine is actually a facade of morality that's meant to justify existing systems rather than to seek justice or to create virtue. I actually have a lecture for students on how the principles of medical ethics are pernicious. And I have a colleague who has just finished a book on how clinical ethics, the standardization of clinical ethics, is actually robbing medicine of morality. I think both of those claims are right. So to continue on that sort of word vomit, that collection of phrases to describe all of us, Christocentric. Well, if you're going to be Christocentric, it means you're intentionally Christian of a very specific sort. But if you're Christocentric, it also means you don't have illusions that your claims are going to be compelling or even intelligible to everybody else that you're working with or everybody else that you're serving. It means you can't hide your identity, nor would you want to. And I'd suggest that it means that, at least for us, that we're always sort of testing our practices, our relationships and developments, including the practices, relationships, and developments of medicine against that story of Jesus. It's less about creeds and more about gospels. It's less about theological statements about Jesus' personhood and more about the New Testament stories, and asking ourselves, is this particular thing congruent? Is it an appropriate development of? Is it congruent with what has gone before, with the story of Jesus, with the story of the early church, with the story of the martyrs, and so on, but especially with the story of Jesus. If any of you know who Alan Verhey is, he was particularly gifted at this thing of holding up the story of Jesus and holding up the story of the New Testament against modern medicine and saying, where does it fit and where doesn't it fit? If we're Christocentric, I would suggest that that means that we are engaged in a kind of narrative ethic, because it is stories, not rules, not principles, not cost-benefit analysis, not the, imperative to treat everybody as ends in themselves, but it's actually stories from the Gospels, and then stories that try to embody that gospel message. So the stories of the church and the martyrs and various heroes of the faith that that we test against. So that is called narrative ethics. And for reasons we can't do here, I would argue that narrative ethics is a subcomponent of virtue ethics, which we're going to talk about now. So discipleship's another one of those words. So we could set the tone for talking about discipleship. It's the Jesus' call that you have to take up the cross and follow. It's the Sermon on the Mount with those appeals to all those character traits of hunger and thirsting for righteousness, being merciful, being pure of heart, being peacemakers, and so on. But if we care about discipleship is first and foremost about formation and apprenticeship. It's about becoming certain sorts of people with certain types of habits, dispositions, and skills. And in ethics language, that is virtue ethics. The little picture there is a picture of my first book from many years ago. And interestingly enough, it's been people of other traditions that have been most interested in the book. The book has continued to sell well for decades. But it's been mostly like Catholics and Calvinists and others who have been most interested in it, rather than people from our own tradition. And yet most of those folks, when they read it, they recognize how very Mennonite it is. So I've always been puzzled by that. But in any case, I think an Anabaptist ethic that's a discipleship ethic is inherently and necessarily a virtue ethic, because we are trying to become certain sorts of people within certain sorts of communities who have certain kinds of dispositions and skills and habits. It matters a great deal whether you're generous and kind and humble. These are the languages that comes out all the time about humility, about patience, about courage. And that's what I think a discipleship ethic is. But that would also then have a great deal to do with medicine. As an aside, my ethics students have increasingly said to me that as they've thought about what kind of people they want to be, and what kind of character traits they need to have in order to be good physicians, they are sort of stunned by how important it is not just to have empathy, but to have courage. So courage, empathy, and imagination tend to be the ones they end up focusing on the most, because it is hard to be the right sort of person in the setting that you all inhabit. And for a virtue ethic, it doesn't mean you're not ever interested in hard cases or quandaries or rules, but all those things are secondary to becoming the right sort of people within the right sorts of community, because the right sort of people get it right most of the time. If you are generous and humble and kind and courageous and have empathy on your day-to-day interactions with people, you're going to get it right. And most of the time in your meetings, in your committees, in your hard cases, you're also going to get it right. Community means that moral discernment is going to be a process of sharing experience and wisdom. It also means that spaces like the church, or maybe like Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship, become absolutely essential, because it is those contexts that provide the support and instruction and formation and accountability that allow you to be the right sort of people in a medicine that wants you to be something very different. We'll keep going. So if you think about community and medicine and medical ethics, what an Anabaptist ethic of community would mean, one of the things it's going to do is it's going to sort of reject the oversized role of autonomy in contemporary medicine. So in our society and in our medicine, autonomy is the principle among the principles. If we're honest, it is in most ethics committees, in most bedside decisions, autonomy rules overall. And autonomy got all of this privileged place in medical ethics in part as an answer to abuses in medical research and in physician paternalism. But those worthy goals are much better done in other ways. They're better done by talking about patients as being in the image of God. They're better done by talking about respect and intrinsic worth and dignity and honesty, rather than a principle of autonomy, which is incredibly difficult to rail in. And in practice, autonomy means on the one side that we allow people to do almost anything they want in the name of their own choices, quite apart from whether they're wise or moral or appropriate. And on the other side, in the name of autonomy, we've abandoned people. We've abandoned the unsheltered and the mentally ill in the name of autonomy. Walk down the street of any large city and tell me what autonomy has done for us. Yeah. And the other reality is just that philosophically, autonomy is a fiction. Sociologically, autonomy is a fiction. And we, as people who know something about community, we ought to be pushing back against this pretty hard. Mutual aid. There are entire books about mutual aid within Anabaptist groups. We could talk about currently Amish sharing, or the old MMA, Mennonite mutual aid, or contemporary about the Corinthian plan. All these are efforts to do mutual aid. But in terms of thinking about healthcare, aside from trying to make sure that people have access to care or access to insurance, I know of Anabaptist related organizations where there's a kind of reorientation of salaries that I would argue is a kind of mutual aid, where the physicians and the executives are taking lower salaries to make sure that the other people on staff have living wages. There's other kinds of reorientations that happen too, but the reorientation of money, I would argue, is a form of aid, not just a form of justice. And that has deep and profound implications for how we practice medicine, especially if we would take that to our peers outside the church and say, there are different ways of doing care. Mutual aid would, of course, push towards universal access to care, like our peers have in other places. Stewardship and simplicity, again, as Anabaptist values. On the one side, it means that we're going to take care of ourselves and we're going to try and model care for the body because the body is a good gift, right? That we're going to try and take care of relationships because they are good gifts. But it also means that we're going to resist a lot of things about medicine. We're going to resist the high cost of healthcare. We're going to resist the intemperate salaries. Right now, roughly 50% of physicians in the US think they're underpaid. Now, I know that's because they feel overworked. But considering that family med docs make 3 times the average salary, to say specialists are underpaid in the US really is difficult to give credibility to. Simplicity would challenge a system that consumes 18% of the gross domestic product, where waste is the theme. waste in plastics, waste in food, waste in energy. I'll be talking tomorrow about the relationship between healthcare and climate. Well, one of the realities is that healthcare drives climate change, and it is largely because it is a system based on waste, and we have to fix that. Our stewardship and simplicity, I think, pushes against aggressive end-of-life interventions. I think it pushes against sort of endless fertility interventions. It pushes against patients who demand procedures that have little benefit. It pushes against certain forms of plastic surgery. I mean, we could make the list go on and on, right? That our medicine, as we practice it in North America, especially in the US, is based on waste, not on generosity or abundance, but on waste. And it's this weird back and forth between claiming scarcity and then wasting all the time. And I think our values push against that. I think there are these values of simplicity and stewardship press for a healthcare that is driven by renewable energy, plant-based diets, lower cost drugs and interventions, reusable materials, and collaboration instead of competition between healthcare settings. One of the reasons our healthcare costs so much is because we continue to compete against each other for patients. This is foolishness. Stewardship and simplicity, I think, would also force us to pay a lot more attention to the social and structural determinants of health, which I assume is language that most of the people on this Zoom call know. But it means that we would care about housing as medicine, as food as medicine, about green spaces, about education, about active and public transportation structures and so on. That if we really are stewards, if we really care about simplicity, then we would have to care about the things that drive cost and reduce benefit, and that the best way of engaging people for their own human thriving is often things outside of the clinic. God's love, justice, mercy, and generosity. I wish I could see all your faces, because part of what I would want to say to you is just, how does that language sound to you compared to beneficence, non-maleficence, right? I mean, what is beneficence and non-maleficence sound like compared to love and mercy? Both of them use language of justice, but of course, biblical justice has almost nothing to do with the justice of medicine, right? So the justice in the Bible has to do with fixing relationships and restructuring distribution of goods. Justice in medicine has been primarily about what do we do with protecting research subjects, and what do we do with technology that isn't available to everybody. Those are not the same thing. So we shouldn't let justice and medicine fool us into thinking they mean the same thing we do, because they absolutely do not. Yeah. So in any case, I just think love, mercy, generosity, this sounds so very different than the language that permeates most of medical ethics. And yet it's so rich and so inspiring and pulls us out of ourselves. And I just think about, like, what would ERs look like if mercy and generosity were the dominant themes instead of suspicion and scarcity? What would biblically inspired justice say to law enforcement's presence in our healthcare settings? What would these things say to the people who are struggling with substance use disorders or who are heavy? These are all places where the principles of medical ethics just don't have anything useful to say, frankly. And what would love, justice, mercy, and generosity look like just in terms of how much time we allocate to patients? Where, any of you who are still in practice or were in practice recently enough, the pressure to see patients for shorter and shorter times. Not sure what happened there. I think love, justice, generosity, and mercy would have something to say about firing patients, not only about the activity itself, but even about the language. And I think they would all both push us and pull us out of the clinic. That these are the things that pull us into the streets and the alleys and the jungles and the wastelands. These are the things that also pull us into local politics. And they're the things that pull us into the halls of Congress. That if we take all of these seriously, we cannot care about people's health and believe in love, justice, mercy, and generosity and keep ourselves only within the clinic walls. Nonviolence, it's for medicine, it would be a partial foundation for things like informed consent and truth-telling. I think it's a much better foundation than autonomy, which is in most books, that's the autonomy is the reason that we should tell the truth and keep people informed. But I think instead, if we realize that we have to respect people and not violate them, we know that not giving them the relevant information or hiding truth from them is a form of violence. I think nonviolence is why we are reluctant to use the law to override conscience of patients and providers, even when we strongly disagree with them. I think nonviolence is part of the reason why Anabaptist types, at least the sort of Mennonite Anabaptist types, have really complicated feelings and attitudes towards abortion, because we're trying to be nonviolent towards all the parties involved. I think nonviolence in medicine would mean that we'd have to treat things like gun violence as a medical problem, as a public health problem. Nonviolence means that we would see environmental degradation, not just climate change, but all the things we've been doing since the days of redlining to people, as a form of violence, as a form of medicalized violence. That when we expose people to chemicals, when we expose them to unclean, unsafe, lead-infested water, that when we put them downwind of the coal plants, these are forms of health violence. Sacrificial service. I think that among other things in terms of medicine, honestly, most of you on the call would be better examples of this than I am. But I think that sacrificial service means, among other things, that it's going to affect what specialties we choose, how we practice those specialties, and what geographical regions we go to. So I would push, younger Mennonites to think about their specialties, not only in terms of their interests, but who is underserved. And in terms of where they want to practice, who is underserved. So, it might be the inner cities and it might be the rural regions where we need to go, because those are the people who aren't getting the care. And I suspect that, we would see a lot more people in family medicine and OB-GYN and geriatrics and ophthalmology than in a lot of the other specialties, mostly because those are the areas where people are underserved. We don't have enough folks providing care. I think sacrificial service also means, and I didn't really know where to put this. This could have been in anywhere, even including discipleship and Christology. But health can't be an idol. It's something that we should take care of. But the one who calls us to pick up a cross, the one who calls us to be sacrificial, means that health can never be sought merely for its own sake or to maximize longevity, that we have to have a faith, or a faith that's rooted in the martyrs, that's rooted in Jesus, that's rooted in the cross, means we know that there are things that are just much worse than suffering and death. And that we often rightly suffer, or we often rightly sacrifice physical health for the sake of other people. Healing and hope, this is some of the language from the Confession of Faith. I've been in many congregations who have different ways of enacting this with movements and reciting it. But one of the things that, like, Willard Swartley kept reminding us, but so did any of you who remember Erwin Waltner, that healing is a manifestation. Healing and health are at least partial manifestations of God's redeeming kingdom. And that when you're working at health, when you're working at people finding wholeness, you're doing kingdom work. And we ought to be saying this to each other, and we ought to be saying that to the new grads coming out, that this is God work, that this is kingdom work that you're doing, and that you ought not to forget it. But that in the Bible and in the early church, that inbreaking of the kingdom is all kinds of healing. It is physical healing, it's spiritual healing, it's emotional healing, it's interpersonal healing, it's trauma healing, that all of those things are part of the making whole, the shalom, the salvation that God brings. But it is never singularly physical, and it always has to be ordered by the kingdom priorities. So that willingness to sacrifice on the one side and seeing health and thriving on the other as good gifts that are signs of kingdom, those things have to be held together. And like most good gifts, literally like almost every good gift, it can be turned into an idol, right? So health in our society for a certain population is absolutely an idol. It's sought at the cost of service. It's sought at the cost of relationships. It's sought at the cost of many things, including our neighbors. And the little secondary bullet point there doesn't really belong there, but honestly, I don't know where to put it, except that if we're thinking about healing and hope and Mennonite priorities and being countercultural, we should maybe have a skeptical eye towards all the TV dramas that idolize and venerate physicians and medical people. I don't think this is good for us. And if you want to know why it isn't good for us, I suggest you think about all the ways in which we've done the same thing with law enforcement and with soldiers on dramas, on TV dramas, and how what that creates in our population, their expectations and their uncritical appraisal of those groups. There are currently at least 4 TV shows where the physicians are godlike in their ability to bring healing to people. I think it's a mistake when physicians become substitutes for Christ. So that was the sort of word cloud and effort to put things in some kind of order and say, all those words already imply a medical ethic, right? Almost every one of those words, not only did I say it's an ethic, but I said it's a medical ethic. All those things that you guys already believe is true about who you aspire to be has direct ramifications for what a medical ethic would look like. And frankly, I think you all know that. I mean, I think you come to these meetings already having a sense of what it means to be somebody who aspires to be in that Anabaptist tradition and seeking to serve your patients. What I want to end with is that piece from Norman Krauss that I put up there on the second slide. Quite a long time ago, maybe 25 years ago, I wrote this thing on chaplaincy, and the more I've thought about it, the more I've thought that it's not just relevant to hospital chaplains, it's relevant to anybody who's trying to work in healthcare. What Norman was doing is he was looking at MCC, and what I've tried to do is also said everything that Norman did was also applicable to civilian public service. So I want to hold these up as two sort of analogs, two groups that are in our history that are doing work of service and care, right? So civilian public service, if there's anybody on here that doesn't know, was for World War II, what sort of Mennonite, Amish brethren, and a few other groups, Quakers and some others, who were conscientious objectors, they did service instead, and several thousand were placed in mental hospitals, which were genuinely abhorrent places, and slowly changed the nature of those places. But in any case, what Norman wants to say is that if we look at MCC or other sorts of related or similar organizations, we would want to talk about agapeic intervention. And so this is what he says about that. MCC is an institution of agapeic intervention in situations of need. It does not send service workers into various parts of the world merely to be respectful and sympathetically present, but to be catalytic and dialogical change agents. This is fundamentally implicit in the explicit Christian identity as part of the God movement inaugurated by Jesus Christ. That would take more unpacking than I have, but what he means is that by catalyst, he means working respectively and unobtrusively to change. So it's not simply accepting what is, but that we are resisting and working to overcome those inhibiting elements that are getting in the way of human well-being and thriving. So we are there, MCC is there, civilian public service was there, that I would say Anabaptist physicians and nurses and other kinds of healthcare workers are there to be agents of change, to change the system as it stands, and that the method Norman suggests is what he calls dialogical. So a method of change involving open and respectful relationships, seeking mutual understanding. So part of the reason this is really important is because Norman points out that you can't have real dialogue unless you know who you are. That dialogue requires identities, that you can't have dialogue between nobodies. It means very patient listening. It means the ability to empathize and hear the other and imagine what the world looks like and feels like to them. It means also being willing to frankly and honestly share one's own experience. But it does not mean uncritically doing whatever they want. It does not mean uncritical agreement, and it doesn't mean shooting for the lowest common denominator. That if you're an agent of change and you're looking through you're looking for dialogue to be sort of not only the method, but the sort of paradigm of your method. You're looking to understand each other in a way that you move towards something more truthful, more engaging, something better than what you have. And Norman doesn't talk about this, but I do in that old piece, that to be an agent of change in the terms that he's laying out requires a whole host of virtues that, you have to be humble, patient, you have to have empathy, honesty, courage, imagination, and hope. And you can see some of the reasons there. But all of these things also have a lot to say very directly to medicine. It takes courage to be steadfast in your convictions, but also to change your convictions when they need the change. It takes courage to tell people the hard truth. It takes courage to give people bad news. It takes courage to admit that you don't know. It takes courage to stand up to people who, in a hierarchical system, have more power than you do. It takes imagination to look for the answers, that countercultural, out-of-the-box answers. It takes hope to believe that we can get somewhere, that we can have a healthcare that is more sustainable, that is more just, that is more caring. That I don't remember who said earlier, healthcare is really broken. Well, I mean, hope is necessary to believe that we're going to have, that we can have a healthcare that is better. And to look and see these little pockets, that when we see places like Good Sam in Atlanta, that when we see places like Maple City, that when we see places, and they're far from perfect, but they are pointers to something better, that we can all be driving for. So, and I think that Norman's old piece that was done completely in-house for MCC, this idea of agapeic intervention, that civilian public service, that MCC, that they remind us that it is possible to be catalysts for change, that healthcare can be more humane, caring, accessible, and sustainable, that it is possible not only to stand with those who suffer, but there's value in standing with those who suffer, even when all we can do is be present to them, because it's an expression of God's mercy. That one can be lovingly, respectfully present in secular settings without downplaying your faith commitments or denominational allegiances, but also, frankly, without heavy-handed proselytizing. That's not what these groups were doing. It is one reason why I have a more complicated take on using Mennonite mission agencies as analogs, because I think the history there is a little bit more complicated. And it's not like MCC or CPS was perfect either. And that in any case, all these things require virtuous people sustained by virtuous communities. If we're not rooted in communities that are going to teach us how to be and hold us accountable and sustain us and support us, we really don't have a lot of choice or a lot of chance. And one of the reasons why I hope that groups like Mennonite Healthcare Fellowship find a really vibrant new life is because we are putting Mennonite and brethren and other kids out into medicine as new physicians without communities to sustain them. So some of those impulses that Paul pointed to are absolutely critical. If people are going to have the kind of character and skills necessary to navigate medicine well. So I have no idea what the time is, but there we go. So I'm going to say thanks in Q&A, but that's my contact. Is that big enough for people to read? Kate, you're the only person I can see.
I think that it's nearly big enough, but what I'm going to do is just type it out really quickly to everyone, kotva@outlook.com and Jake.
Well, and honestly, by far and away, the fastest, easiest way to get me always is that phone number on WhatsApp. Because my students know they can get me 24/7. So I'm always attentive to that in a way that I'm not attentive to other things. So if you have a pressing reason to get me, there you go.
You and I are similar in that. I always say, if you need me, text me, which is great. Joe, this just had so much food for thought.
Can I kill this now?
I think you can. I think there's a way to do it. If you just stop screen
right,
share.
Right. No, I was asking if it was appropriate to stop it.
Perfect. There were so many quotes in there and so many things. And really, we hoped by putting Paul's framing of the history and your framing of sort of moving towards an ethic, that they would speak to each other. And I know my experience sitting here is that is that they very much did. So at this point, we just want to open for questions, comments for both of our speakers, Paul and Joe. So please, you should have the ability to unmute yourself. And of course, thank you both so much. A round of applause. We can do the visual applause and appreciation. But folks who have a comment or a question, whether you want to put it in the chat or you just want to unmute yourself and speak, I think we really try to be a group that can speak with each other. I always appreciate that.
If there are things in the chat, Kate, can you maybe attend to that?
So far, it's just a lot of thanks.
Oh, well, that's very kind.
Lorna.
Joe, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm 10 years retired, but ethics in medicine was always my, I don't know, I just couldn't get it, put it that way. But what you have described is how I lived out my practice. And it's so affirming to hear that after all this time, in a way. I mean, I had Christian mentors. I was so lucky. I mean, I knew God was moving in my life when he moved me to a different city to get into medicine, where there was this wonderful Christian medical community, of whom many were Mennonites. So they brought all their virtuous community values to that. And, you know, even in more recent years, when our healthcare institutions are bringing things like cultural sensitivity training and all that, I grew up in an indigenous community. I worked with indigenous people for most of my career in one way or the other. And I just always maintained that be myself as a Christian. And as you said, it works. It worked for me. I got through my career. I never had to go to court. If that's one measure, you know what I'm saying? That sort of thing, right? And I attribute that also to the fact that I went to Bible college, Mennonite Bible College, and graduated before I went into medicine. And I think that also really created that virtuous community foundation. And I hear a number of you went to Eastern Mennonite College and so forth. You had the same background, right? That's so important. I learned about balance before I even got into medicine, you know, that kind of thing. So thank you so much, Joe.
While people are thinking, I do not know how cultural sensitivity training works at other medical schools. What I can tell you, sort of, I know this is being recorded, but keep this in-house, is that so much of the supposed cultural training doesn't understand the cultures that they're talking about. And it absolutely makes me crazy. And I know this in part because in Indiana, Mennonites and especially the Amish come up a lot in these training sessions. And I'm like, oh gosh, you guys don't know anything about the people you're talking about. And you're trying to train our students in being good listeners and attending to the people they're around. And all your examples are wrong. Yeah, same thing actually with Jehovah's Witnesses. The examples are so often just horribly wrong. Yeah.
Joe, I have to tell you, because if you search what do Amish or Mennonites believe medically in Google, the MHF website is one of the first hits. I actually get calls on the regular from physicians, often on the younger end, like fellows and residents who have an Amish patient who needs some kind of intervention that involves technology. And they call me with a lot of moral distress, saying, I need your help to figure out what to do. You know, they're Amish, they don't use electricity. How can we do this? You know, a ventilator or something. And I will tell you, more than 50% of the time, they've not actually talked to their patient before calling me.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, you're making assumptions based on a categorical thing you've Googled before you talk to the patient. And at Cincinnati Children's, we call every Jehovah's Witness family if their child is set for surgery, if they've reported their Jehovah's Witness, because we want to have that conversation before the child goes into surgery. I will tell you, well over 75% say, you know, actually, as much as I know my religion says no blood products, if my child is suffering and needs blood products, just do it. And it's a really interesting thing, right? Like, we make a lot of categorical assumptions without really talking to the folks and asking them how they would handle this question.
I see the phrase in the chat, cultural humility, and I am so happy to see that term coming into medical education and medical student and resident education in the last 10 years. No phrase is perfect, but it does encourage more curiosity than just learning about what Jehovah's Witnesses think or what Mennonites think. One of the most fun experiences of my life was doing a presentation at Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio, where I brought an Amish patient and an Amish bishop, and we took questions from the audience. And it was so enlightening for the students, residents, faculty who were there to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, and change the way they thought about being culturally responsive. I do want to say one other thing about virtue ethics. I've always been a fan of virtue ethics as well from the 1990s. But I always saw it as adding a dimension to principle-based ethics, as does case-based ethics. Each approach brings a different perspective, and I do think one does not replace the other. Each is a check on the other, but I really like those 4 words as a counter to the 4 principles that are thrown around most of the time.
I really appreciated you bringing up how, in some ways, the typical ways of looking at bioethics, including, you know, autonomy, non-malevolence, beneficence, those are big words, but they're not that demanding. And to some extent, a Christocentric ethic is actually more demanding. And I've thought for a long time about this, like this idea of autonomy, and it's so complicated in pediatrics, right? Like, how do we talk about autonomy in pediatrics? Is it parent autonomy? Is it child autonomy? But it's not necessarily what Jesus preached or practiced. Jesus didn't actually get informed consent from the demoniac before he, you know, ran the demons out into the pigs.
Well, also didn't get consent from the poor farmers who lost their pigs.
Right. I always feel bad for those poor guys. And if you're an animal ethics, you know, person, for the pigs. But yeah, like I think about this and I'm like, how does this, you know, fit with the Christian ethic? I don't know. And so, Paul, I also appreciate, I think, you know, Joe, you're really questioning the concept. Paul, you're really giving this historical view of what could be possible as an alternate. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So when you say it's not very demanding, that is such an understatement. If you read through the literature in medicine, not just the philosophical literature, but the literature specifically in medicine about things like, what does beneficence mean? It means you should do good for people, providing that it's not very hard. Literally, I mean, that's literally what it means, is you should do good for people if it isn't very hard. And it's like, well, not only does that not fit with our ethic, but frankly, it doesn't actually fit with the ethic of most of the students that show up at my school. You know, they want more than that. You know, some of them are there for status and money. But an awful lot of them are there because they are willing to work hard and sacrifice a lot for other people's well-being. And that is just not captured in beneficence. I think it is captured in other things. But yeah, I actually have an 1.5-hour lecture on why the principle. So it's 45 minutes on how did we get the principles of medical ethics. So here's the history of it, and then 45 minutes on why this is such a bad idea. Yeah, and how it is how much it undermines our ability to actually have moral medicine. So. Kate, I'm also aware that it's 9. I'm happy to stay on. I'm guessing that Paul, where'd you go? Oh, we'll be happy to stay on. But I also feel like, at least from my perspective, we always should, honor time with people and say that they shouldn't feel like they have to hang on, that they're not being rude.
Yes, I think that's very helpful. If you are someone who, a little bit like me, loves to go to bed early, do feel free. You are not being rude if you need to drop off at this point and join us tomorrow. I sent the Friday link out. I will be sending the Saturday link out as soon as we're done here. I just didn't want to overwhelm all of our participants with links. So you will have that in multiple formats by the morning. But I also saw, for those of us that want to keep discussing, I saw Donna unmute herself, and I want to see what her comment or question is.
Yeah, I'm just really, really grateful for this time this evening, both for Paul's deep and wide history of this organization. And also, Joe, I've not met you before, but I'm just grateful for what you shared for us, because I'm when I think about what we're talking about, is it like we're like the word that comes to me is we're in a wrestling match. It's like we're in a wrestling match with a healthcare system, and I define that very broadly because I work for the courts. I do mental health evaluations for the courts, but also have worked in health in epilepsy care as a neuropsychologist, and we're like as Mennonites, Anabaptists, believers who are providing care for people who have, that really in many cases are the least, people that just don't have all the privileges that we have. And so it's like we're at a wrestling match, and it's this organization, I feel like, and I mean that in the most nonviolent way when I say wrestling match. I think about my father, get out the wrestling blanket. Let's be together. Let's figure this out. That's what we're here to do, is to figure out together, how do we move forward as followers of Jesus in systems that have no interest in following an ethic of Jesus. And so you have, both Paul and Joe have really, helped us at the beginning of this weekend conference to kind of, at least for me, refocus. Oh yeah, that's why we're here. That's why we're doing this, because we're called to be followers of Jesus, number one. And we are also called to be healthcare providers in the very broad sense of the word. And how can we wrestle with that together and move forward? Because I'm convinced we will move forward. The Holy Spirit will show us, but this is all part of the process. So thank you so very much.
See, now, I think Dan is gone, right? Dan Nafziger? Yeah, that's too bad, because I was going to say nice things about Goshen Hospital. Um, um, like, obviously, there are plenty of places of light within the system, right? And we shouldn't forget those places of light. Um, yeah, it's just one small example. My students during clerkships, far and away, their best experience with OB-GYN is at Goshen Hospital. And it's so consistently positive that something there, something life-giving is happening there.
I have to tell you, Joe, I went to seminary with a number of people who have now gone to nursing school and become OB-GYN nurses at Goshen Hospital. So they have a handful of former pastors who are now their nurses.
Well, I don't know what all is doing it, but something good is happening.
Well, and I see, Nicole Groff is here, and she's at Esperanza Health Center, here in Philadelphia, which also has a long history with Mennonites. So I think there really are these spaces. They're imperfect spaces, but they're spaces. And I think they have these moments of hope. And I think, Paul, of your story, in West Virginia, this clinic in this space being a moment of hope. And yeah, I think about, and Sharadi and how it's formed so many, of our board members, Stan, it's not in the US, but it's still, I think, a place of that hope.
I'd like to ask a question. We were thinking of this presentation, thank you, Joe, as relating to an Anabaptist healthcare ethic. Would a Catholic steeped in Catholic social values graded at a lot of what you said, or would there have been quite a bit of parallel thinking between what you described as Anabaptist and what a Catholic would see as coming from Catholic healthcare or Catholic social values?
Well, yes. It's interesting that for the last probably 10 years, I've actually spent very little of my energy thinking through sort of denominational lenses. I think through what I think are authentically Christian lenses and what that looks like and what that has to look like. It is to me also, just at a very personal level, Catholics have always been much more interested in my work than Mennonites have. And I just mean that at literally every single thing I've ever published. It's not just that there are more Catholics, they're just more interested. And so I think that suggests that at least some of what I'm saying resonates. But if you are talking very specifically about Catholic social teaching, the vast majority would resonate. There's still in Catholic thought, though, a wanting to have more say over society. There's still a less commitment to what I think is nonviolence, although a whole life ethic in Catholic thinking goes a long way. but yeah, I think that a great deal of what I said would resonate with most of my peers. Last week I was in Boston at an event for my PhD mentor, Jim Keenan. It was an absolutely lovely, wonderful event. But of the 100 scholars that were there, I think 98 of them were Catholic. And I think all of them would have affirmed almost everything I said. But some of that is also just the traditions have come together, right? There's a bringing together of sort of Anabaptist and Reformed, Anabaptist and Catholic, in ways that just wasn't true when I was a kid. But that's a super winded way of saying that I affirm your instinct, and Catholic social teaching would affirm almost everything.
Michael Sheridan, I'm keeping with that theme. I was struck by the Pope's weighing in on the national election and basically saying neither candidate is pro-life, and he singled out Harris for her stance on abortion and Trump for his treatment of immigrants, which I thought was interesting. And yet it sort of goes back to that idea of Catholicism wanting more of a say in how government works. And perhaps I've just wondered, in our Anabaptist ethic, do we assume that we are Christians working inside of a essentially non-Christian institutional setting, right? Where we can't necessarily expect our institution to be Christian, even when they have, Methodist on the on the sign outside or whatnot. These are businesses, and they work with insurance companies, and we get a trove of things that is going to be kind of almost antithetical to our Anabaptist healthcare ethic. Is that how you would see it, or can we Christianize our institution?
I'd be interested in knowing how other people respond to that.
Okay, this is Joe Longacre. I have a comment, Joe, and a question, which kind of relates to that. My comment is, when you put out those words that you took 5 minutes to develop and then rearrange them or arrange them in a sequence, I looked at that and I did not see words that I thought did not belong there, nor did I see something's missing. So I think it was, quickly done, but quite good. So I would affirm the way you arranged those words. My question is this: I practiced 50 years, mostly in what we would call a secular group, and the concepts, the values, principles, and practices that you told us about, which were very good, which I affirm and wish I had heard this sooner. Where are our young people who are being trained hearing that? Now, in your institution, you have a chance to share this, but where do other people hear this? What I heard was, you're not allowed to see Medicaid patients, but I saw them anyway. I was called in twice because I wasn't charging enough. I mean, these are examples of what I was hearing and observing, of course, standard or typical or usual practices. So how do people who don't have the benefit of listening to you for an hour learn that, especially if they're in the place where they could make changes? And does MHF have a role in that?
So, there are little pockets that are quite wonderful. Duke Medical School, also the seminary, has a theology and medicine program that does a lot of training on what it means to be a Christian in medicine. That is often quite good. There's a lot of things happening at Loma Linda that is quite rich. Right? So, I mean, there are these pockets. There are residency programs that you can go into that are genuinely genuinely care about health equity, that genuinely care about street medicine. There are residency programs. One of our students didn't end up going there, but there's a residency program in Chicago that is very overtly Christian and talks about seeing Christ in every one of their patients, all of whom are desperately poor. So I think there are these pockets, but one of the things I'm not doing because we're not in person is I'm not giving you the presentation on how broken medical education is. We might be doing that later in the year. But I think that medical education is one of the most morally malforming things imaginable. There are a few places that are different, but on aggregate, it's a deeply worrisome thing. And we have lots of empirical evidence that people come out of medical education worse than they went in. This is true both of the sort of undergrad medical education and residency. So if you're worried about it, I'm worried about it too. And again, like, this is why I hope that groups like this find new energized footing, because there really are people who will be, if you figure out how to connect with them, will be ever so grateful to have a place to talk about what they're seeing and to hear a message that's different, that will encourage them to spend more time with patients, that will encourage them to take a loss on patients, that, you know, all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to, I was going to say something that touches on the point you just made about medical education. I live in a townhouse community, and right beside us on the other side of the wall are 3 medical students who are living together in starting out their residencies, living here for, you know, about 3 years or so before they move on somewhere else. And it's been very interesting and troubling to me to hear what they're going through, and also an opportunity to talk about some of these values and how they're or not getting that in their education. So it's sort of a built-in opportunity for me, just neighborhood-wise, to, you know, create campfire opportunities to eat together, talk, whatever. I also wanted to say something about that Goshen Hospital. I spent 10 years there, and it was in that public institutional setting that I realized there's many Anabaptist type folk working there. That's what makes the difference. And yet, even as an institution, we weren't serving the needs very well of those who were the stranger and the immigrant coming into the communities, many who weren't documented. So a couple of us, including myself, became founding. We put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears the first couple of years into starting and developing the center, what became known as the Center for Healing and Hope. And what was very interesting to me was that right from the start, it was Catholics and Mennonites working together with these values. These, you know, we did some what you would call agape intervention, catalytic work, but we also had shared values about what we needed to do and be in that free clinic environment. And gradually, we had other Christians from other denominations, Lutherans, Methodists, you know, Presbyterians. We ended up having, in the time I was there, I think 7 years before I moved to Australia, 46 different churches and volunteers working together with these shared values to reach out and provide, basic interventions, and actually created a collaboration with Goshen Hospital where they gave us a lot of grants, which was very essential to keep going. It was a truly community collaborative effort between the institutions and the volunteers, centered around those shared values. So it's a good model for ecumenical work. That's not necessarily all Anabaptist, but it was very parallel to the values that you shared tonight.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Joe and Joe, both Joes. I really resonate with this question of, in such a broken system, because it is the system I think that we are living with right now. Even when there are these little exceptions, in terms of programs where people can go to medical school, but it's also not just medical school that's broken. It's also nursing education in some places. I will give a caveat perhaps to Wanda, in her program. And I know Wanda, one of her passions is bringing the social determinants of health, into that space and bringing justice conversations. But that is one school, right? Out of so many nursing schools. Nursing, I would even say, if you wanted me to go on about the broken state of chaplaincy education, do not get me started. Deeply, deeply broken. And yet, how do we expand this conversation to the folks who are in that education right now or coming out of it in an early career? My experience, and I think, there's members of our board who would reflect this, is that sometimes you can survive the education. And then shockingly, those first few years of practice are that's where all of that sort of leftover stress kind of breaks you. And I think if we're being, observant and honest about who's engaging with MHF and who we're able to reach, I deeply believe, and it's why I'm here, that MHF can have a role, and a huge role. And for the younger folks and earlier career folks who have engaged with MHF, I think all of them would say it's played a huge role in helping them live their values and find their values and reconnect with community. But that's a fairly small number. And this question of how do we expand, and how do we expand with not a lot of staff capacity, right? I'm our only paid staff member. How do we expand and reach folks, and especially younger folks who are in medical school or in early career, who are deeply overwhelmed right now? And how do we help them understand that MHF isn't yet another thing they have to do that is overwhelming, but is actually a life-giving thing that can help transform their perspective on all it is they're already doing? I don't actually have a perfect answer to that question, and maybe I should, sitting here as the executive director. I don't. It's a question I'm asking, and it's a question that I do look at the folks in this room and think most of you got involved with MHF when you were in your 20s and 30s. And so what made the difference for you, and how do we reach out, and how do we find those folks? Because I hear from Elisa, who's on our board, and others, that being a part of MHF, these are our sort of 30-somethings crew, really makes a difference. But how do we expand it from, the 5 and 6 folks, Lubov, Elisa, Andrew, me? How do we expand that? It's a question I'm asking everyone because I have only imperfect answers.
I'm not sure you're going to get. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Joe.
Well, there are a few of us unmuted, so I'm not sure who meant to speak. I'm not sure that you're going to get great answers at 9:30 on Friday night to a very complicated question. I do have a couple ideas that I want to kick around with you over time about how to reach people while they're still in school. But it does seem to me that you've got at least two things. One is that there's a critical mass issue, that until you get enough people of a certain age, it's hard for other people to see themselves there, right? So when they see people like them there, it gets a little easier. We're seeing the same thing in our churches. Churches that have a substantial number of young families don't actually have that much trouble attracting young families. Churches that don't have those folks have more trouble because you don't see, it's hard to envision yourself there, right? And the other thing is, one is a problem I'm actually facing this year, that the students in the ethics program will tell you that it allows them to get through med school, that it's work, but it's the kind of work that provides a community for them that allows them to make sense of medical education. And it allows them to go through as a whole person. But the current cohort who's came in the door a couple months ago, they're looking at it and all they can see is how hard they're working, and this looks like more work. And you got to catch their imagination that they can see how more work might be less work, right? How more work might be healthier. So I frankly, I need my other students to go talk to them because they're not going to believe me. And you kind of need that. You kind of need those people to become your missionaries. To go out and say, it is a little bit of time and it is a little bit of money, but you're going to find that you have an island of sanity. Yeah.
I was thinking when I grew up, there was a big suspicion of education. And it's okay. We're allowed to go to college if we're either going to be a teacher, a nurse, or a doctor. These were all service professions.
Yeah.
And service was sort of in our blood. We were all going to 1W and stuff, and that was sort of the main thing. That's what you went to school for. And I don't think we have that underlying value anymore in our church society, and certainly we never really did in our general society. But that's sort of what bothers me. In the late 80s, we all moved into business and making money and stuff. And anyway, that's sort of the way I see it.
I want to put together a couple of themes that I heard just from Stan and Joe and Kate about the experience, Stan, that you had in the late 80s and how we've addressed this problem over time. And I want to reflect on a mentor who a spiritual mentor of mine who previously I was complaining at one point about the brokenness of the system. It says, Andrew, the system's been broken for a lot longer than you've been paying attention to it. I'm 30, to be clear, and I was complaining about the brokenness of the system, and this gentleman, Mennonite pastor of mine, said the system's been broken a lot longer than you've ever been paying attention to it. So that makes me think of then Paul's framework that he presented in his discussion, and asked the question, not necessarily to Paul, but more broadly, although Paul, if you do have an answer, I'd be glad to hear it, of, okay, so let's take Paul's framework, and is there a response in the form of an adaptation to the framework that meets a new modern challenge, right? If Stan was experiencing similar brokenness in the 80s, right? Then is there an evolution of the model that Paul kind of very, very cleanly, I think, laid out for us? And I don't know the answer to that, but I have to think, okay, if the system's been broken for a lot longer than I've been paying attention to it, do we need a different framework to address the problem? Again, I say that expecting no answer from anyone right now, though if you have an answer later, I'd love to hear it.
I think it was helpful for me to see Paul's framework. You know, you kind of have the three parts, and that it's evolving. How Anabaptists engage in healthcare and think about healthcare is not this static thing. It's not a rock. It's not it is and it isn't. I mean, to some extent, there are certain aspects of it, and I would point then from Paul's framework, I would also point to Joe's, you know, love, generosity, justice, and say those, I think, have been steady aspects of an Anabaptist relationship with healthcare. But this idea of your sort of phases makes me say, well, what's the next phase? What's coming next? And that it isn't static, and it helps me to feel less hopeless in the place that I'm in.
I think in some ways there's always been a tension between being in the world and of the world. And that there tends to be this, we go one direction towards separation, and then we realize we need to make a corrective. And I think in some ways that's what's happening.
I've been involved with Mennonite Action, and I've been so impressed the way the leadership and the enthusiasm of the young people that are taking hold of that, specifically towards the conflict in the Middle East. And I just wonder if there are any parallels that we can learn from, as it seems like, at least I know some of the young people were really on the fringes of the church, and yet they're moving in and providing leadership to this movement. Because I think they're seeing their faith that they were brought up with suddenly in action. And can we do the same thing in healthcare somehow a bit more? And I'm not sure I have any answers, but we talk about, our belief in meeting the needs of the least of these, and being with them and living with them. Can we model that somewhere, how in healthcare? And would that attract more of the young people if we can do that? And I think the speeches tonight were a good start on that. Some of the uniqueness we have as Christians as we practice healthcare. I don't know how we get the message out there in a way to make it exciting enough, but yeah.
I'm reminded of the quote by Maya Angelou, attributed to her, that is, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. And I'm when I read this, I think about a number of years ago, I read the book about Ori Miller, The Life of Ori Miller by John Sharp, My Calling to Fulfill. I love the book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And the struggles that he went through to eventually create Mennonite Central Committee that's held up as like, oh, what a great organization, which I think overall it is. And yet, boy, were there struggles along the way. A lot of people said this is not where he should be putting his energy because it's not just about salvation. At least that's my short rendition of it. And I remember reading it and thinking, he was serving the needs, seeing these deep needs of the Mennonites in Eastern Europe. And we need to help our people, that was, as I recall, really where it started. And I thought, my goodness, this guy was from Indiana and his wife was from Pennsylvania. And there was no thought, no awareness, as far as I can tell, of the injustices that were being done to the indigenous people that had previously been on those lands. Well, now we have an awareness of that. In the Mennonite church, we have an awareness of that. And you know, I think this speaks to in all of healthcare, it's really okay. We see we only saw through the glass darkly, and now we're starting to see, oh my gosh, we are really in a pickle here. We this system that we're up against is really working against the ethics that we hold to as followers of Jesus. And that's not a new idea. That is not a new idea. We've seen that, but we have new language for it as empire. And then it's about, okay, how are we going to work together to support one another, to wrestle with these ideas, and then to be I remember a book that I read when I was in my teen years and college years of out of the salt shaker and into the world. How we are here with other believers that believe in this ethic, and then say, how do we go out there and be who Jesus wants us to be with others who we connect with, whether they're Catholic or they're Christians or Muslims or whoever, that have a similar ethic, to live out this ethic that's very different than what the world teaches. So again, I don't have the answers, but I love the idea that we have a place to wrestle with this together.
Yeah. Donna, I think that is the perfect wrap-up comment for tonight. We have tomorrow. I will be sending out the link for tomorrow. Thank you all for being here. I don't want to cut something off short, but I know it's late for a lot of us, and we are coming back in the morning. Thank you especially to Paul and to Joe. And yes, thank you to each of you. We hope we will see you at the morning at 9 for our conversation with the board about the future of MHF. So actually it's like a perfect segue into that question. Oh, this is fun. I can like briefly see Nicole and Sherry there finally. And about the future of MHF, and then transitioning to our next keynote, which is again with Joe.
Oh, Sharon Groff.
Yeah, Sharon. Hi. This is so great. But I look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow, and have a wonderful evening.